In this section, let's start talking about some more advanced configuration templating capabilities. So if we look in here, I have a few playbooks, and let's look at this testinclude.yml. So now we look at this playbook, and we can see I'm operating on localhost. I have gather facts set to false. I'm using the template module. And if I search for my source, I'm just going to change this to the standard YAML format. Search for my destination. Once again, convert it to the standard YAML format. Now, I'm using this template here, and here's some variables that I'm going to use inside that template. Now, let's go ahead and look at that branch office EX1 template. And I'm going to actually just change that to be branch office 1, move branch office EX1 to branch office 1. Now, if we look at this template, we see pretty standard things. We have some config lines, we have some config lines. We get in here and we have a variable being populated. But now look at this statement here. We have an include hostname.j2. And what is include hostname.j2 going to do? It's actually going to include some other Jinja 2 template inside of this one. So if we go look at what is in hostname.j2, we actually just see that it includes these 4 lines, which is basically just saying repeat the host name 4 times, populated by that variable. Now that ultimately would be invalid Cisco CLI, but you can hopefully get the general idea that we can include other templates inside of each other. So we can include template 1 inside of template 2. And let's go ahead and look at what that looks like when we execute this. We've generated the files. We go in here. And in this case, we actually just generated this PyNet router 1 and PyNet router 2. And we can see that we've generated this host name 4 times that was included from that other template. And then similarly, we've updated this gateway. We look at PyNet router 2, we see this host name 4 times, and it came from that second template that was included. Go ahead and delete all these output files. Let's look at this second example of using an include statement. Shrink it a little bit, see if I can make the line wrap not quite as ugly. Okay, so now we're looking at this template. Once again, we're operating on local. I'm going to convert this over to YAML format. Okay, YAML format. Now I'm going to use, in this case, branch office 2. I'm going to rename that to branch office 2. So we're going to use this template. We're going to generate the output files here. And here's our variables that we're using. Now notice that one of these variables, this model interfaces, actually refers to a Jinja 2 template. So for PyNet router 1, it refers to this Jinja 2 template. For PyNet router 2, it refers to this Jinja 2 template. And then let's go ahead and look at our branch office 2.j2 option. So here you see that we have the hostname variable getting populated, the IP default gateway getting populated, but now notice here we have an include statement. What are we including? We're including some other template, but this other template is actually dynamically generated or dynamically selected based on this variable. So for PyNet router 2, it's going to be the 881 template, which is going to look like, or excuse me, for PyNet router 1, it's going to be the 881 template, which looks like this. So it has fast Ethernet 0 through 4. And in this other template, it's going to look like that, which has a gig interface instead. And you can see it'll use one versus the other. So basically, as opposed to hard coding which template we're including, we've made a variable out that, and then we've nested these templates, but in a variableized way. And let's go ahead and execute that playbook. Okay, and let me look at the error that I'm getting. Oh, I executed it wrong. I tried to execute it directly on the template. That is not going to work. I'm going to execute it on the playbook. We go into configs. We see here that we're generating router 1. We see that this interface section has been swapped in. The 881 interfaces, we see the host name's been updated, the gateway's been updated. We see the IP has been updated. We go into router 2. We see it has its host name. We see it has the 891 interface. And then we see it also has a gateway. So we're dynamically including additional template, but this case based on something that's a variable. So includes give you the way of swapping in a external template, of basically including other templates inside of some, outer template. And you could have multiple include statements in a given templating file. So that includes. Now, let's go ahead and look at a second more advanced topic, and this second topic is macros. So in Python, you can use functions, and you can do a similar thing with Jinja 2. So let's look at this access switch _1.j2 template. So if you notice at the top here, I have a macro statement. A macro is going to basically be the equivalent of a Python function. Notice I've done my curly brace %. Notice I have this funky ending syntax. -% curly brace. Similarly here, I have a curly brace %, and then I have my end macro. Now this is the equivalent of my Python function name. So interface trunk is my Python function name. And then I have arguments. And just like with Python, I can give these arguments default values. So I'm going to have a native VLAN 1, a trunk allowed VLAN with a default argument of 1. Then this is just standardized text. And then here we have some things that have been variableized. The native VLAN and the trunk allowed VLAN. Then we have a second macro. This one's called interface _access with these 2 lines and this 1 default value. Now notice here how I call the macro. So I do my variable reference, and as opposed to just directly referencing a variable, I actually reference the macro, and then I can pass in arguments. So here I pass in arguments of a native VLAN and a trunk allowed VLAN. I get down to here, and you can see I have some access ports, and I've specified their access VLAN. The other elements are pretty similar to what we've seen before. So I'll go into configs, I'll remove all those files. I'll go ahead and execute this test macro.yaml, generate those files, and then we could look at them and see that it's blown out the configurations using those macros that I've specified. So macros in Jinja 2 give you the capability of recreating basically functions. Now let's go ahead and look at this second macro example. Now here noticed I have some variables including my interfaces. I have my interface names, and I've specified, are they an access switch or a trunk port? Access port or a trunk port? I go into my template, we get down in here, and I have a for loop. So I loop over the interfaces. Interfaces are defined here. I then basically say if it's a trunk port, call this macro, and I specify the arguments. If it's an access port, call this macro, and I specify the arguments. So this Jinja 2 template here is combining the combination of macros with for loops and conditionals, and showing you how you could potentially combine those. As you can start to see with this, you're starting to get some pretty complicated constructs in your template. And I think you're going to have this inherent trade-off of how complex do you want to make your template, and is it just becoming so complex that it's getting unmanageable? So be careful of how much complexity you're adding in your playbook. Now if I go ahead and execute this, generate our configs, I cd into here, I look at one of these, and you can see I have some access ports, and then you see fast Ethernet 3 and 4 were defined as trunks. And if I go ahead and look back at my playbook, you can look here that on switch 2, I had the first 3 as access ports, the second 2 as trunk ports, so it looks like it generated that correctly.